I'm Andrew Branstead. With me is Mitch Christensen. We are back, of sorts.
Yeah, second podcast.
Second podcast. And we're old hands at this now, I think.
Very experienced. I have a beard now. And
Yeah.
You still have a beard.
I still have a beard. Again, for a while I didn't have a beard. Not that anyone can see us. It's radio. So I'm taller than I sound. I wanted to sit down and talk about stuff again, and so did you, and so here we are. No, this is an assignment for our, it's the final for our Lit Ed 4117 course, which is what? Teaching literature methods?
Yeah, we look at traditional forms of teaching, and then we also look at critiques to the traditional forms of teaching and how we might be able to implement these into the classroom. So just kind of like exposure that there's more than just the sage on the stage, students in the desks, and that lecturing kind of style.
I'm sure you didn't make up sage on the stage, but I like that.
I did not make that up.
I'm going to steal that. It's the teacher as gatekeeper, which I think we're going to get into a little bit here. So this is, as we say, our second podcast. Previously, we talked about students' experiences with reading, and now it's shifting to a more teacher-focused idea of us as pre-service teachers and talking a little bit of pedagogy. We have 3 books, which you can't see, but I will make book noises. Here they are.
I've got 2 other books here.
Yeah. Well, okay, I have the 1, and there's 2, so that makes 3. These are from our class. They were textbooks, sort of, things that we read mutually and discussed, and they have some different ideas and things in them as far as how teaching works traditionally, how teaching might work alternatively, I guess, non-traditionally, and what that means. So I believe you've got more to say about those particular books than I do to start off.
Sure.
So do you want to talk about what the Growing Critically Conscious Teachers book?
Yeah, definitely. The first book that I got here is called Growing Critically Conscious Teachers, as Andrew said, and then it's a social justice curriculum for educators of Latina youth. So it looks at that specific context of Latina, but otherwise we can probably extrapolate some of those approaches into just a general education course. Otherwise, it's edited by Angela. I'm gonna probably butcher this, so I apologize. Valenzuela, and let's just go ahead and dive right in.
If she's listening to our podcast, we're thrilled, and that's awesome. Never going to happen, and we're sorry. What we're talking about, just for an audience refresher framework, I guess, is we're talking about sort of critiques of the traditional approaches to education and curriculum and how that's offered up in these particular texts. So I guess, what does the Growing Critically Conscious Teachers say with regards to maybe an alternative way of doing things?
Yeah, definitely. Into the second chapter. First, we get a little bit of introduction in the first chapter, of course. I mean, that's pretty standard, but otherwise, the part of the book that really stood out to me was the second chapter, which goes into, how do we actually go about teaching from this critically conscious standpoint. And something that really stuck with me was this idea of teaching from a social paradigm. And a direct quote pulled from that book is a commitment to instruct in a revolutionary or counter-hegemonic fashion. So I know that kind of sounds very educated, and it's highfalutin terms there, but if I just break it down for you.
Please.
It means teaching from a standpoint in which away from the majority culture and kind of that dominant culture. So to teach from a social paradigm, it talks about the idea of creating a critical consciousness in students. This means that students become aware of their own situations in life, and what that can look like is examine their education. Do they have old textbooks, new textbooks? What do their facilities look like? What sort of expectations do they have? And then even into the social and economic aspects of their life. Are they treated differently? Are they part of a different socioeconomic class? And then what's that mobility look like from the socioeconomic classes? So it wants students to become aware of these situations that they're in, because from there, it moves into this idea of fostering agency in students. That students can make changes in the world around them, and that as a teacher, we're not up there just lecturing to them. We are helping them. We're coaching them, and we're supporting them to create initiatives in which to change the world around them with social issues.
So that's different from standard teaching, just because of the way it's trying to empower students, I guess, to give them, first make them aware, hey, here's what the situation is. It might not be as presented to you. And then here's how you can affect the world. Is that a nice summary?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Is that I think in history and in other classes as well, you become aware of that there are social issues.
Yeah.
And that there seems to be a disconnect with, okay, if there's social issues, how do I create an impact with these social issues as a student? Because it feels like, you're all alone. Like how can you do this? You need you don't feel like you can really have a hand in it. And from teaching this from this standpoint, the teacher really helps them say, okay, there's issues, but like, let me show you some different ways in which we can, change them together and in groups. So,
which is a super important step, because a lot of times I feel like identifying issues is something we've gotten better at. Saying, yeah, hey, look, here's injustice. That's good. But there's really a step 2, which is then we're going to do what about it?
Yeah, you definitely can't stop at step 1 that says, here's issues. Okay, then the logical step is step 2. How do we change these issues?
Sure. I think that's super useful. It's a great tool to take with us, and it feeds nicely into the book. I mean, we all read these, but this is what I wanted to focus on is Christopher Emdin's For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. What I think is really important to mention too is the subtitle, which is Reality, Pedagogy, and Urban Education. So this is a textbook about teaching in an urban environment, sort of. First of all, I'd like to formally recommend this book to any involved in the teaching profession. I've heard of this book. I've had it recommended to me in other courses, teaching of English in particular. Oh yeah, if you haven't read that, you should definitely read that. So for white folks who teach in the hood, and the rest of y'all too, it's worth picking up and reading. Obviously, that culture and interacting with it's going to be more challenging if it's not your own, if you're an outsider, that kind of a thing. But still, there's value in here regardless of whether you consider yourself to be teaching into like an urban area like that or not. He says that, this is a critique he puts out, is that teachers working in urban schools sometimes adapt a kind of savior attitude towards students, where we're here to save these students from some kind of substandard culture which they're a part of. And again, I don't think, yes, that particularly applies to the situation he's describing, but I think you talked about the teacher as the, how did you put that up? The sage on the stage?
Yeah. We talked about this in class too, and I think it's a pretty apt metaphor, this idea of this messiah complex that teachers, and it's a good, it's a good place to be at as a teacher. You want, if you're going into education and you don't want to have a positive impact, I think you're going in for the wrong reasons.
Sure.
But this messiah complex is this idea, if you break down the metaphor, that you have to sacrifice yourself. You have to somehow lose yourself, maybe burn out, leave behind advocates and disciples that will carry on your teachings. But it implies this sense of burning out early because you're doing all this work that's so revolutionary that everyone is kind of opposed to it and reacts against it. Like if you look at biblical history, everyone's looking at the figure of Jesus and saying, what is this guy, what is he doing, this is weird, and
Sure.
And consequently he dies.
Sure.
So
and it's probably not going to be as dramatic as that in the school setting.
No,
but
I mean it could.
Yeah, we looked at you and I had this conversation off air, off tape, whatever, and it really got me thinking about the way that teachers are portrayed in movies, and I know that was part of our conversation. My son, my oldest son, just happened to watch Dead Poets Society, and I totally coincidentally, I was wandering by and went, oh, I was just talking about this. So it's striking how much that lens of the Messiah figure, the savior from outside, applies to that narrative that they're putting out in that movie. And yeah, it's just a movie, but we're a couple of English majors, so I think we see the value in a story and the symbolism in a story speaking to a cultural idea or concept that exists outside of movies or books or whatever. because Robin Williams in that movie, I mean, there's almost a Judas character. He's sort of betrayed by one of the students. It's really very much in that tradition of what you're talking about.
Yep.
So you hinted on this a little bit. It's a tempting philosophy because it feels noble. I mean, we do want to empower students to escape whatever negative situation they may or may not be in. Obviously, if students are living in poverty, for example, we want them to be able to get out of that. That's a big point in education, right? At least that's what we say. Like, oh, you got to better yourself so you can, live a better life or a happier life or whatever that means to you. And that's great, but the trouble with this kind of thinking is that if you let it become your main thinking, it doesn't work. Because it's rooted in a kind of colonial mentality where there's a good culture and a bad culture, a way of thinking that historically I don't think has really helped anyone. So that's identifying the problem. And I just said a little bit ago, okay, great, what are you going to do about it? So what Ed suggests in this book is finding ways of valuing students' cultures as a means to reach them. He does this by showing different ways to use things already found in African American culture. Framing devices for teaching based on rap ciphers, for example. And he puts that as a kind of cultural circle in which people of different backgrounds, maybe different levels within their culture, can engage one another in kind of a back and forth learning experience. He also talks about the Pentecostal church and how that's very much like a school. And he's not advocating, hey, necessarily do these things exactly as they are. What he's saying is look at them and find the learning, the value in them, and say, look, there's teaching going on here, there's learning going on here, why and how, and then incorporating some of those ideas into your own teaching. And it's not appropriating it, it's adapting to it rather than resisting it. Because if your two options are, hey, we don't do that here, or okay, how can we use that as a lesson, or how can we engage you through that, that's the better choice of those two. What I think is what he's trying to say.
And just talking about this book and this idea of this Messiah complex within teachers, this way in which to teach. This brings me back to the book that I was talking about, and that you're teaching from a social paradigm. And what happens if you're a white teacher in the situation where you are leading, say, a class population of mostly minority students,
right?
From Latin American origins, mixture of black students, white students, doesn't matter. So you're teaching from the standpoint of resisting the dominant culture, and ideas that they have made to for self-affirmation.
Sure.
So how do you do that as a white teacher? That's a question I'm openly asking you. But then because I kind of struggled with this. I was like, okay, this is a critique against a traditional approach. But how do we do this as white teachers? Does it seem hypocritical that we would be leading this and coaching students on social action? Would that be creating a messiah figure?
I think it's something you have to actively, if you keep it in mind, that's, I think, the most important thing. Meaning, make choices very consciously as to what you're putting into your pedagogy, into your curriculum, into your unit design, whatever it is. I think that's a big first step, because a lot of times just self-awareness, I think, is important. Because you're right, there is a fine line between even taking the charged sort of racial ideas out of it for a moment. Just think of something that exists in any school setting, regardless of it, even if it's homogenous, is the teacher is older than the students. Mm-hmm. So you have a generation gap. And if you aren't careful, you can be pandering. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to work. If you're trying to use the slang that the kids are using or something in an inauthentic way, that's just going to turn them away rather than engage them. So even more so if you're from a dominant culture and you're teaching a group of largely minority students, like you said, you can't adapt it yourself in an inauthentic way. You have to, I think, just respect it. And that's probably where letting the students teach you comes in. Mm-hmm. So you get off the stage, maybe a little bit, get off the pedestal and say, hey, here's what we're learning. Here's a cool way to engage it. Have you ever thought that it might apply to this thing that already exists in your culture? And then let them come back to you with exactly what that means.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So it's instead of the sage on the stage, it's maybe the sage on the sidelines or something like that. But
Sure.
because I think you're right. I think what you're getting at is that you need to openly identify and say, hey, I am a white teacher. I'm a part of the dominant culture, and by being conscious of the position of life that you're in, that I think this generates trust. This generates respect. Like I know I'm white. I know I'm part of the dominant culture, and I'm gonna do my best to not teach from this position, but for all of us to respect our positions that we're in, and then go from there on how can we create social change, knowing that to the groups that we belong to, that I think that self-identification helps.
I agree, and I think for me, what I would want to do is one of the things that erases or at least diminishes prejudice or biases or what have you in any environment is familiarity and empathy. And you say, well, I would self-identify, hey, I know I'm part of this culture. Another thing is just to say, hey, I'm me, I'm an individual, I'm not part of a collective hive mind,
Sure.
And neither are you.
Sure.
And you're different, and I'm different, and you have your own cultural experiences, and that's valuable, and I have some that are valuable too, and let's try to meet in the middle. And because it's very difficult to say that, people from over there, they're no good. But if you know somebody from over there, like, well, they're all right. So a big step toward that is maybe making yourself a little more vulnerable. And that's brought up in for white folks who teach in the hood a little bit, how the teachers felt a little intimidated and scared of his students in a way. There was just a culture there where, these kids are, they're bad kids, or they're tough kids, or they're not going to listen, or they're troublemakers, or whatever it is. And you have to get over that to a degree anyway, and say, hey, you're just a person, I'm just a person. Let's try to find some common ground. But there's also the roles of, I'm here to teach you, you're here to learn.
Yeah. So eliminate those generalizations. I am white, but I am my own person. I am in some ways perhaps like this culture, but I am myself, and I think that's important to distinguish, because in identifying that I am this individual, you eliminate racial barriers, racial lines, and that way you can connect with each student individually.
Yeah, and it's not pretending that differences don't exist, because
No.
that's not authentic. And it's not acknowledging places in which you might have, a position of privilege or not understand something totally that someone else does from an experience. That's all very valuable and important. But yeah, I think just, hey, being a person really helps. It's hard to be. I mean, think of teachers that are portrayed. We're going back to media a little bit. When you think of a bad teacher, you're like a negative teacher. They're either really boring or really strict and unapproachable. They're distant. There's some wall around them that makes them not human or away from you, above you. And any chance you can to eliminate those within, professional limits, and still keeping some kind of a dynamic between you, I think it's good. And that dynamic for me is, I had a teacher I really liked, who, everybody asks you that question as a teacher, who's a teacher who really inspired you? I had a teacher who used to say, I don't need any 17-year-old friends, and you don't need any 40-year-old friends. And I thought that was a great quote, because he was this really caring teacher who, he had kind of a tough love way of applying it. But when he said that, he didn't mean, I'm not here for you. That was where he kept that boundary up between, here's where I am, here's where you are. So personally, I believe in some of that, but not to the point in which it affects things in a negative way. I want to be very approachable and very transparent. Does that make sense? I don't know your thoughts.
I would come from the same approach. You can't walk into the classroom and expect, that everyone wants to be your friend.
No.
And I don't think that would lead to a healthy classroom environment. You want to be friendly, and you want to be their mentor and help them out. But
Sure.
If you approach it from a friend's standpoint, I think, that's a little too familiar, and
It doesn't do anybody any good.
No.
And so, just like we said before, it's about finding a balance.
Yeah.
In a lot of things, between professionalism and openness to understanding people as individuals. I don't know if we want to talk. I feel like we would be a little remiss if we didn't hit on something from that Studio Thinking book.
Sure.
I know one thing we liked about it, and this isn't necessarily answering the question the prompt for this podcast of, what's a method you want to take away from this, but the book is really user friendly. Is that it's friendly
definitely.
layout and such? It's really easy to work with. Is there something in particular in there that stood out to you as here's a different way of thinking as a teacher that I want to totally grab and take with me?
Yeah, I think there's a reason why I gravitated towards this book. For those who do not know me, for our avid listeners,
Both of them.
Andrew and I have talked to each other a lot, and I think Andrew has probably gotten this inkling about my personality. But I'm a huge proponent of studio thinking and studio organization and design of your classroom. I work in a literary journal called the North American Review at the University of Northern Iowa. And it's literally just a studio. We all get in there. We have like computers everywhere and paper, and we're working on 8 billion things 100 miles per hour at once, and it's really awesome. And I think it's just a wonderful environment because there's just so much going on. But to return to the book, it's called Studio Thinking 2, The Real Benefits of Visual Arts Education. So it comes from the standpoint of, art. But once again, we can extrapolate some of the benefits of this approach compared to the traditional one-size-fits-all approach.
Mm-hmm.
So the critique of this book towards traditional education is that in traditional education, everyone is lumped into groups. You go through and you learn everything at the same time in the same manner. And some students say they catch on more quickly than others. Others might need a little bit more time. And by going through these groups, it kind of keeps everyone together. That's great, but also it kind of limits some people, and it also kind of hurts some people that are falling behind.
Mm-hmm.
So, and from a studio approach, what's really great about it is that there's a bit of demonstration and lecture. This allows the teacher to get up there, give some sort of coaching. This is just a short part of the class in which tips are provided, and then the majority of the work, honestly, is where students are spending time working on the problem or creating whatever they need to create for a project or anything else. So this is time for students to actually work with the problem instead of just having the entire class time devoted to this is what the problem is. This goes back to the idea of identifying. Okay, we've identified the problem, but let's give them time to actually work with the problem. And I think this is getting back to what we talked about. And then from there, students will then critique, meaning that they're going to do continual formative assessment. As a teacher, you're walking around while they're working independently in small groups and large groups, and you're checking in with them. Where are we at? And then another way to approach it too in studio thinking is that there's peer critique, peer feedback response, and students are learning to be critical and provide analysis and say, okay, I think this is working here. I think this is not working there. And that's it's not an easy skill to build. And it comes out of this mastery mindset, this mastery mentality that I'm going to continue working on something until I am a master at it. And then the last part of this kind of structure with studio thinking that I think is very meaningful and very beneficial is this idea of exhibition. It makes the projects and the product, so it comes from this idea of a product mentality where you finish with a product. It makes the project and the work more meaningful because it's something to show off.
Sure.
You're going to have an audience. And I think as a student that this kind of ups the ante, that you're, okay, I'm going to have someone that's looking at this, but also gives students a sense to show off their work. I don't show people my paper I wrote in 11th grade, about power differentials and Lord of the Flies.
You should.
And there's a reason why I'm bringing it up, Andrew. I'm actually really proud of that paper.
Yeah. I can tell.
I really liked it. But the thing is, in a traditional classroom, it's okay. It's graded. It's handed back to you. That's end of story.
That's a super valid point. And it's almost like when you turn something in, it goes into some kind of void. And then eventually the void spits it back out and it has a grade on it. And then what are you supposed to do with it?
Yeah.
Like, do you keep it in a shoebox? Do you put it on Facebook? Look, I wrote a good paper. Yeah, I don't know. And I really completely see the value in artifact building in school. And as an English teacher, there's a lot of opportunity for that because you gave a caveat that, this book is about visual education, visual arts, but the arts and writing are pretty close relatives. Yep. So lots of opportunity there. You have to think outside the norm a little bit. There's lots of opportunity there to create cool things, maybe a class publication
Yeah.
or something that can be showed off
Definitely.
and kept in the end. Well, at the risk of running really long on a podcast, I want to I don't want to cut the conversation off, but one of the questions that we haven't answered that was just pretty much directly asked in here is, when you get into the class, with your own classroom, will you teach using an alternative approach or the traditional way or some kind of a combination? Do you have a manifesto? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think that teachers cannot revolt against the traditional method. I think that as a qualified teacher, it involves using your professionalism and your informed opinion that maybe traditional opinion might work well for this lesson, for this part of the section, but then I'm all for moving into alternative approaches, because I think that we've seen just how valuable they are. That as a teacher, you can't say, I'm totally against traditional the traditional method.
Sure.
I think that you need to have some fluidity and move between them. But as far as the one that I like the most, definitely studio thinking, definitely studio design, partly because that's how my mind works, but it's also because I'm really big on students having agency in my classroom and this idea of co-educating. I love where I can almost just melt into the background. If I could somehow paint myself the color of the wall,
Sure.
I'd be sinking against the background and whispering, continue, keep going, you can do this. And that's where I'm really happy, and I think that I get a lot of elation out of being a teacher, is that students, they forget that it's work, like it's schoolwork. It's fun to them. It's something that drives them. So for me, definitely a studio thinking kind of approach would be my kind of approach.
I am aiming for a blend. As I said before, I'm a big believer in the value of moderation, and I think going one way or the other completely just doesn't work. And I'm also trying to be really pragmatic. I think that any pedagogy is only as valuable as its results. And one thing I've learned here is, not directly, but if you look at things like education psychology and actual research-based methods, most of that stuff is a pretty recent idea, as though we only in the past, I'm not going to put a number on it, but if you look at how long people have been instructing other people,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at how long we've looked into researching, well, what's actually working and showing results, it's a tiny, tiny fraction, and that seems kind of crazy to me. So one other thing I know is that this is not going to be easy. It's going to take practice. It's going to take experience. It's going to take time to figure out what works for you, what works for your students, and you always have to be changing and on your feet. So yeah, absolutely, I'm going to take some of these methods and these ideas, these concepts and philosophies, and yeah, I'm going to rely on the traditional in some cases too, because it's not as though nothing in the classroom traditional works. That's not true at all. There's a place for that kind of stuff. But boy, if you're just up there lecturing every single day and they're just writing 5-paragraph essays and turning them in, they're just going to disengage. You talk about agency, and one of the biggest agencies that students in a captive environment have is to check out. They don't have to learn.
They choose not to.
Yeah, and if they're in a situation where they have to go to school, and they have to be there with you during that day because there's some punishment or it's just the right thing to do or whatever, and you find a way to push them off or make them feel isolated or take away their agency, they're going to grab it back in the only way they can, by not engaging. Like, I'm not reading this. And that's the last thing I want. So if it means rethinking how I approach things, okay, great. And give them back that agency and be transparent about it, which you touched on earlier, and that's exactly how I feel about things. Hey, I'm a white guy from Iowa. I know what a white guy from Iowa knows. If I'm in a largely urban setting, regardless of the racial demographics, I'm not from there. I'm not from the big city. That's a different world.
Yeah.
And so help me help you. I know stuff, you know stuff, and hopefully the end results are pretty good. But I fear that teacher burnout and that savior mentality thing that leads into it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a quick burning flame, and that it can go over and that it can end very quickly. But because just one last thing we need to talk about too is the what are some things that we covered in our class, not necessarily through our readings, but just like open discussion. We can talk a little bit about that first. But you brought up a really excellent idea that I just want to talk about real quickly. That I don't think that as educators or in the field of education we've been as cognizant as of our approaches and looking at the evidence and research involved. Like what are the outcomes of using these different approaches. I would just want to pick your brain a little bit.
Okay.
Do you think that this is a defining factor, or at least a characteristic of new wave educators, new wave education, where educators are trying to become aware of what they know, that they're looking at traditional methods and are saying, okay, these work, but I'm also trying to find the best way to educate my students?
Based on my limited experience as a pre-service teacher, yeah, it sure seems that way. It seems like there was a movement, and I couldn't tell you exactly when or where it went away or gained or lost strength, but it seems like at the beginning there was, this is how we teach students, and they will listen, and you think of like the one-room schoolhouse, and they're pointing up at we're reciting things that we've memorized, and we're spelling, and we're all that, and then getting into all the studio thinking and actual. It's like a self-awareness thing. I know there's a term for that. It's like a metacognition thing, but applied to teachers.
Sure.
And I don't know why. It seems new to me. New as in, within the last, 30 years or something.
Sure.
I hate to put a number on it because
sure.
like, actually, in 1950. Yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah, someone with the books is going to be saying something.
Right, one of our two listeners. But but you see what I mean. When all this began, that's not where we were. And now here we are, and we're thinking about it. So, I think it's an emerging feeling out process, and I'm assuming there's resistance to it.
Yeah, I don't doubt it, because it comes back to this idea of fitting students to a model, which I think is the traditional approach, where this is how we do things here, and the students have to adapt to that. But this new way of looking at approaches is, how do I adapt my way of teaching, my curriculum to my students?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where that teacher professionalism comes out of. It's that it takes this knowledge. Okay, what can I do to maximize their learning and their growth as an individual? So I think that's where the change is coming from.
Well, we can demonstrate pretty clearly, particularly in economically challenged areas and schools that are there, not a huge success rate. You talk about like the school to prison pipeline and things like that. So there are examples of, hey, look, this is failing or not working. And we touched on that in our class discussions. I think people had different ideas about that. Do you see this as being maybe a way out from that kind of thing? Is this the solution? Not a panacea. Not do this, but just being aware.
The school to prison pipeline, I think, is just more than approach. I think it's systemic racism.
Sure.
It's this idea that it's this mentality of looking at how do we treat individuals from different cultures, subcultures, co-cultures differently.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that by looking at different approaches, I think this would definitely help. I think it's going to be a number of factors. It's going to be cognizant of systemic racism and trying to combat that, but it's also these approaches that have you look at students in a different way and also have the students look at themselves in a different way. And I think that is definitely a way to combat against these ideas of, the school to prison pipeline. So we had quite a few discussions about, what do students offer that they can bring into the classroom?
Mm-hmm.
They have this wealth of information and knowledge and their own different perspective on the world, and that needs to be shared, Otherwise, it's going to build this idea that my opinion doesn't matter and that I might not matter, and that's not right. So by having students value what they bring to the classroom, I think is a great way to improve not only their learning, but also to build an effective community in the classroom where everyone is valued. And then lastly, this goes along with, the students' knowledge that they bring to the classroom, but earning their respect, getting to know your students. At George Washington Carver Academy, they spend an entire week, some teachers do, spend an entire week getting to know their students with like activities because it works. We had Principal Mahoon that was talking about how she's seen this approach work where teachers have gotten, have spent the time to get to know their students, and that this pays off for the rest of the year because there's this relationship going on. And I think that we can talk about this confidently in our I Am From projects.
Sure.
one of the students I worked with, she made it quite clear to me that she didn't care about me and that I was in the classroom with her, and and that was kind of shocking, But
Yeah.
I said, okay, you know what, I'm gonna. I could have ran away from that, but I said, you know what, I want to work with her. I want to get to know her, and I want her to get to know me, that I care about her,
Yeah.
And so I did, and it was really awesome. We were laughing and talking about family memories and stories by the end of it, and it was really great. So I think this comes from this idea of respect and spending the time to get to know your students.
Yeah. Second podcast, two of a series of two.
Mm-hmm.
for
Two of
forever.
two.
Yes, 2 of 2. Thank you for listening. We ramble a little bit. What I think is cool is that you and I have talked, as you mentioned earlier, here and there throughout the last couple of years. Sometimes I just start rambling about something, and these kind of discussions are really good. They're valuable to me, and I hope to continue them. And I would say, if you're listening to this and you're not just the person grading it, as a pre-service teacher or even a teacher actively teaching right now, don't forget the value in speaking to others. You're not an isolated being. You're amongst other people who I'm sure you know this if you have experience, but I am reminding myself all the time that my fears, my trepidations, my challenges are not unique to me. They're shared by everybody else entering the profession or in the profession. So I think that's valuable. And just to talk these out and go, yeah, I never thought of it that way, or I absolutely think of it that way, and I'm glad you do too. Whatever it is, super valuable. So thanks for sharing and being open and your time, I guess.
Yeah, it was awesome talking to you, Andrew, and I hope you guys had a great time listening to us ramble about education and where we can change some things or where we would like to see some improvements. So
yeah, I wish I could point you toward a sponsor or something. I feel like a real podcaster. Buy a mattress. No, I have no idea. All right, and thanks to Dr. Meacham.
Yeah, thank you very much for helping us generate these conversations.